Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Kennedy, and the focus is the 1960 campaign, the convention, and the race against Nixon. The year is 1960, and Kennedy is the frontrunner heading into the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles for that nomination, but he knew to win, he really had to win on the first or maybe second ballot. If it got beyond that and backroom deals started to come into play, party bosses starting to determine the outcome, that was not going to be in favor of Kennedy. Others were much more aligned with the party insiders, so he needed to make sure that all of his delegates stayed true to form and cast their ballot in his direction. His team, to that extent, was everywhere. They were trying to make sure there were no defections, and Kennedy was really his best advocate himself. He met with state caucus after state caucus, wrapping up those delegates, getting those confirmations, and he had some allies. Like Chicago Mayor Richard Daley helped lock up the 59 votes in the state of Illinois. David Lawrence, the governor of Pennsylvania, doing the same thing, 64 votes hanging in the balance there in the state of Pennsylvania. This was going to be close. He needed 761 votes for the nomination. Everyone was going to count. Well, he was across town when the roll call started. He was watching on television with his buddy Torby Macdonald, and it was a little bit of a laughable scene because the power kept going out and they'd lose the television. Turned out that a new air conditioner in the apartment was sucking up too much power. They turned that thing off. They could watch the roll call the rest of the way, and it was looking good. There were no defections. Things were going according to plan, and with just one state left to go, he was within so close, 750 votes. Wyoming was all that was left, and they had 15, could put him over the top. And then Kennedy saw on television his little brother Ted Kennedy standing near the front of the Wyoming delegation. He knew that it was in the bag. Sure enough, all 15 of those votes went to John Kennedy, and he was the Democratic nominee for president of the United States. Well, immediately he shifted into the next part of the convention because their work was not over yet. They needed a vice presidential candidate. His leader that he really wanted was Lyndon Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader, but he was a little nervous that Johnson might not accept that offer. In fact, he said, "Of course I want Lyndon, but I never want to offer it to him and have him turn me down. I'd be terrifically embarrassed. Lyndon's the natural choice. With him on the ticket, there's no way we could lose." Johnson offered a lot of experience, and he was critical coming from Texas to maybe being able to hold on to the South. Well, the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, also from Texas and a mentor to Johnson, actually got involved and helped Johnson say, yeah, you know what, if it's offered, he'll accept. Why did Rayburn do this? Well, he just wanted to do anything to make sure Richard Nixon didn't get in the White House, and so he was pushing for Johnson's candidacy. JFK went down the back stairs at the Biltmore Hotel, offered the position to Johnson. He accepted right on the spot, and then almost immediately the Kennedys had some buyer's remorse. There were words of a potential floor fight over Johnson's nomination. Maybe he was too conservative for the delegates. The unions had some concerns, so Bobby Kennedy went to see Johnson again, maybe to rescind the offer. Well, he had a conversation with Johnson, and Johnson was pretty adamant. He said, look, if I'm Jack's choice, I'll fight for it. And Bobby and Jack Kennedy agreed. They'll stick with him. In fact, when he was nominated, there was no floor fight because they did the whole thing by voice vote. Lyndon Johnson got the vice presidential nomination by acclamation. The next step, Kennedy decided to move his acceptance speech to the 80,000-seat Los Angeles Coliseum down on the other side of town. This was an opportunity to introduce a new generation of leaders and what Kennedy called the new frontier. Today, our concern must be met with that future, for the world is changing. The old era is ending. The old ways will not do. The problems are not all solved and the battles are not all won, and we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, a frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. For Kennedy, this was an opportunity as a call for action. He needed the people to engage if he was going to be successful and become part of the solution. But the new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises, Kennedy announced. It is a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer the American people, but what I intend to ask of them. And then a phrase that he kept saying over and over again throughout the campaign: it was time to get America moving again, on the way to that new frontier. Well, immediately after the convention, Kennedy sought to unify the party. He met with Adlai Stevenson. He met with Harry Truman. He met with Eleanor Roosevelt. The previous week, they had all been against his candidacy. Well, now they're all on board because they also wanted to make sure they would beat the Vice President Richard Nixon and his ticket mate Henry Cabot Lodge in the fall election. immediately the advantage kind of went to Nixon. He was off running to campaign in all 50 states, while Kennedy spent most of the month of August in Washington, D.C. not campaigning, because the Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson, had actually called for a special session of Congress, or of the Senate rather, in the month of August, and that kept Kennedy away from the campaign trail. But in part, this was a good thing. He had to rest his voice, which was completely gone. By the time they got up to real campaigning in the beginning of September, he was ready to go. And by the way, things were not all that rosy for Richard Nixon either. One incident in particular, the press were pushing the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, to tell us some key decision or some policy that he had embraced based on something that came from Nixon. And Eisenhower was kind of annoyed at the whole discussion, and eventually he blurted out, "If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember." Kind of ouch on that one. And Nixon in the early part of the campaign really tried to distance himself from Eisenhower, kind of be his own man, moving out of the shadow of the very popular president, till late in the campaign, when he knew that this was crunch time, and that's when Ike got involved, helping to make this a very, very close race. Once again, religion was going to be front and center of this race, just like Kennedy had faced in the primaries. Would the United States hand the presidency to a Catholic? It had never been done before, and there were always these concerns about a Catholic having split allegiance. The U.S. Constitution on one side, the Pope on the other. Now, for Kennedy, this was a non-issue that he thought he had kind of buried in the primaries, but a lot of new folks are now looking at his candidacy for the general election, and so he decided to take this head on. Early in the general election campaign, he accepted an invitation from the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. Some 300 Protestant ministers were gathered in Houston, and he opened his address with a bit of a Texas flair. Kennedy said that he spoke of those who fought at the shrine I visited today, the Alamo. For side by side with Bowie and Crockett died Fuentes and McCafferty and Bailey and Bedillo and Carey. But no one knows whether they were Catholics or not, for there was no religious test there, no religious test at the Alamo. Well, what about for the presidency? Well, once again, Kennedy tried to put this issue to bed. He told those ministers in Houston, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me. But if the time should ever come, and I do not concede any conflict to be remotely possible, when my office would require me to either violate my conscience or violate the national interest, then I would resign the office, and I hope any other conscientious public servant would do likewise." Ultimately, this was going to be up to the voters. Also kind of new here for the 1960 campaign, televised debates. They never had those before for a presidential election. In 1960, they had 4 of them, beginning in Chicago, September the 26th, when 70 million Americans tuned in to see Kennedy and Nixon on the same stage. Kennedy was great, calm, cool, well-spoken. He looked great, very much on message. He said, "If we do well here, if we meet our obligations, if we are moving ahead, I think freedom will be secure around the world. If we fail, then freedom fails. Are we doing as much as we can? I do not think we are doing enough." Again, the phrase, it was time to get America moving again. This was, and if it was still, in terms of the substance, Nixon actually did pretty well. In fact, people who listened to the debate on radio thought that Nixon might have even won this debate, but this was television, and Richard Nixon looked awful. His makeup ran. He appeared fatigued. He was wiping the sweat off his brow, almost like he was literally melting under the pressure. After that first debate, the Gallup poll had Kennedy ahead in the race, 49% to 46%. After the 4th debate, it was even a larger gap for Kennedy, 51 to 45%. At this point, though, that's when Eisenhower got involved in the race again, still very popular in the country. This was moving closer and closer as we got toward Election Day. Kennedy had a couple of other positive moves in the last month of the campaign. On October the 14th, he arrived very late, actually the early morning hours. Thousands of people at the University of Michigan were still standing, waiting, and cheering for him, and he decided to come up with a new idea where he asked those in attendance, would they be willing to serve abroad to help the less fortunate around the globe? Eventually, it would be called the Peace Corps, and the whole idea really helped solidify Kennedy's support amongst young people who would eventually volunteer for the Peace Corps in droves. The other area was civil rights. When Kennedy's record on civil rights to date was actually pretty weak. He would often say the right things, but didn't always have the follow-through that civil rights leaders that were really looking for. Well, here, Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights advocate, had just been imprisoned in the state of Georgia, and on Kennedy's team, Harris Wofford suggested to Sergeant Shriver that, look, Kennedy, why don't you call Mrs. King? She's pregnant, she's worried about her husband, just give her a call. And Kennedy thought, let's do it. He said to Coretta Scott King, I know this must be very hard on you. I understand you're expecting a baby. I just wanted you to know that I was thinking about you and Dr. King. If there's anything I can do to help, please feel free to call me. Well, this resonated with Mrs. King, who said, look, it certainly made me feel good that he called me personally and let me know how he felt. I had the feeling that if he was that much concerned, he would do what he could so that Dr. King was let out of jail. I've heard nothing from the vice president or anyone on his staff. Mr. Nixon has been very quiet. And in this case, the Kennedys actually did follow through. Bobby Kennedy got on the phone. He called the governor of Georgia. He called the judge in the case. The next day, MLK was out of jail. They took an opportunity to publicize this story, working with a couple of ministers in the black community in the state of Pennsylvania to distribute some 2 million copies of this story of the phone call to black churches across the country. Kennedy won 70% of the black vote. It was critical in some of the key close states of Illinois, Michigan, and South Carolina, in what was again going to be a very, very close election. Election day is November the 8th of 1960. At midnight, the race is too close to call. At 3:30 in the morning, Kennedy's going to bed. 4 states still hanging in the balance: Illinois, California, Michigan, and Minnesota. Ted Sorensen was the one who woke Kennedy up the next morning at 9 o'clock. He was the first to greet him as the president-elect. Nixon had held on to California, but Kennedy had won the other 3 states to win in the Electoral College. In terms of the popular vote, some of these were very close. Illinois, he won by just 9,000 votes, 0.2%. Texas was also extremely close. In fact, in the national popular vote, Kennedy won by just 118,000 votes out of 69 million cast. That was a difference of 0.17%, the closest popular vote in the 20th century. But of course, it was the Electoral College that mattered, and Kennedy won 22 states compared to Nixon's 26 states. But it was Kennedy who won the bigger states in the North. He held on to the bigger states in the South. Eventually, in the Electoral College, 303 votes for Kennedy, 219 for Nixon, and 15 for Virginia's Harry Byrd. Now, some cried foul over these results. There were accusations against Mayor Daley and the mob boss, Sam Giancana, of perhaps doing some malfeasance, particularly in that state of Illinois. But Richard Nixon refused to contest anything. He said it's time for the country to move on. In fact, he was even agreed to meet with Kennedy at his vacation spot in Key Biscayne, Florida, just a couple of days after the election. Very statesmanlike effort on the part of Nixon, putting a final bow on the 1960 campaign. For Kennedy, this was a campaign of style and substance like his entire career had been. JFK was excellent in both. And for some perspective, you can look to what Ted Sorensen said, who was with JFK every step of the way on this campaign. According to Sorensen, the Kennedy style was special. The grace, the wit, the elegance, the youthful looks will rightly long be remembered. But what mattered most to him, and what in my opinion will matter most to history, was the substance, the strength of his ideas and ideals, his courage and judgment. And it was time to now put those ideas into practice and to get the country moving again. But that's the story for another day. That's John Kennedy in the 1960 campaign, the convention, and the race against Nixon. From the life of John Kennedy. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.